The polished oak door opened, and Carol Peterson walked in like she owned the place, her briefcase sharp, her smile sharper. But across the desk sat the bank president she had underestimated, the same man whose pool she'd filled with 60 cubic feet of concrete. He wasn't just reviewing her loan application, he was about to deliver the consequences of her arrogance. This is the story of what happens when entitlement collides with power it cannot bend. Watch until the end, hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. 6 months earlier, Albert's world was one of serene, well-earned tranquility. Retirement wasn't an ending for him. It was a beginning. After 40 years in the demanding, high-stakes world of finance, culminating in his role as president of the regional community bank, he had finally stepped back. He still sat on the board, a respected figure whose opinion carried immense weight, but his days were his own now. They belonged to the sun-drenched patio, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the cool, inviting turquoise of his backyard pool. This house wasn't just a structure of wood and brick. It was a testament to his life's philosophy. He'd designed it himself decades ago, framing walls and running wires alongside the contractors. His own hands, calloused from a youth spent in his father's mechanic shop, ensuring every joint was perfect, every connection secure. The pool was his masterpiece, a crystal-clear oasis he maintained with the same meticulous care he once applied to billion-dollar ledgers. It was where he taught his children to swim, where he hosted summer barbecues for friends, and now, where he found a quiet peace, floating under the vast blue sky. His neighborhood, Oak Creek Estates, was supposed to be the final, peaceful chapter, a quiet enclave of well-manicured lawns and established families. He'd known most of his neighbors for years, exchanging pleasantries over hedges and sharing tools. The homeowners association was, for most of that time, a benign entity, concerned mostly with the annual picnic and reminding people to bring in their trash cans. But things had changed. A new president had taken over last year. A woman named Carol Peterson. Albert hadn't paid her much mind at first. He was a man who believed in a simple creed: mind your own business, keep your property neat, and be a good neighbor. He followed the rules because it was the decent thing to do. He never imagined that the rules were about to be turned into weapons, and that his peaceful sanctuary was now square in the crosshairs of a petty tyrant. The first sign of trouble arrived not with a bang, but with a crisp, cream-colored envelope tucked under his door knocker. The letter was printed on thick, expensive cardstock, the Oak Creek Estates HOA logo, embossed in an obnoxious gold foil at the top. The tone was patronizingly formal, a cascade of bureaucratic jargon that seemed utterly out of place in their sleepy suburb. It stated, with no room for ambiguity, that his mailbox, a sturdy, hand-built wooden structure that had stood for 20 years and perfectly matched the rustic aesthetic of his home, was in violation of Bylaw 7, Section C, Subsection 4. All curbside mail receptacles must be of a pre-approved uniform, black, powder-coated metal design. It cited a deadline of 14 days for compliance, after which a daily fine of $50 would be levied. Albert read it twice, a small smile of disbelief on his face. He'd read the bylaws cover to cover when he first moved in. He knew for a fact that Section C, Subsection 4, had been voted down at a community meeting 3 years prior. It was a proposal by the new president, Carol, and it had been soundly rejected as an unnecessary and costly mandate. He walked over to his filing cabinet, a relic from his old office that was now neatly organized with household warranties and tax records. He pulled out the thick binder labeled OA and flipped to the relevant section. There it was, in the official meeting minutes he'd insisted on receiving. Motion defeated, 34-5. This wasn't a mistake. This was a test, a probe. Carol Peterson was testing the waters, seeing who was paying attention and who would simply roll over and comply. He'd seen her operate at the few meetings he'd attended since her election. She wielded Robert's rules of order like a bludgeon, cutting off dissenters and steamrolling any discussion that didn't align with her agenda. She was a woman who radiated an aura of unearned superiority, her perfectly coiffed hair and expensive pantsuits, a kind of armor against the common folk she was now meant to govern. Albert sighed. He didn't want a fight. He just wanted to enjoy his coffee and listen to the birds. But his father, a man of few words and unshakable principles, had taught him something crucial. You don't let a bully take an inch, because they'll always come back for the yard. With the letter in hand, Albert decided a direct, neighborly approach was the best first step. He walked down the street to Carol Peterson's house, a gaudy, oversized McMansion that stood in stark contrast to the more modest, established homes in the neighborhood. It was a house that screamed new money and look at me, with a lawn so unnaturally green it looked like it was painted on, and a trio of stone lions guarding the entrance. He rang the bell, and after a moment, Carol herself answered the door. She was dressed in tennis whites, though Albert knew for a fact the nearest court was a 15-minute drive, and it was already 90 degrees outside. She looked at him, then at the letter in his hand, and a practiced, dismissive smile spread across her face. "Albert," she said, her voice a syrupy drawl. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He held up the letter. "Carol, I think there's been a mistake. You've cited me for my mailbox, referencing a bylaw that was voted down 3 years ago." He kept his tone even, non-confrontational. He was giving her an out, a chance to blame it on a clerical error. Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, no mistake, Albert. The board revisited the issue. We determined it was in the best interest of the community's aesthetic unity to implement the standard. It's for the good of our property values, you understand." The board she referred to consisted of herself and 2 other sycophants she'd handpicked. A fact not lost on Albert. "Revisited it when?" Albert asked, his patience beginning to fray. "According to the bylaws, any revision requires a 30-day notice to all homeowners and a majority vote at a general meeting. I don't recall receiving any such notice." Her eyes narrowed slightly. The sweet facade cracked just enough for him to see the cold, hard entitlement beneath. It was an executive session. Emergency aesthetic ordinance. We don't need to trouble the entire community with these minor administrative details. Emergency aesthetic ordinance. The phrase was so absurdly despotic that Albert almost laughed. He was dealing with a wannabe dictator of a 38-house subdivision. This was no longer about a mailbox. This was about power. "Carol," he said, his voice now firm, "that's not how this works. You can't just invent rules. I have the meeting minutes. The proposal was defeated. This notice is invalid." Carol's manufactured smile finally vanished completely, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of pure indignation. It was the look of a queen whose divine right had just been questioned by a peasant. "Listen to me, Albert," she said, her voice dropping the syrupy tone and taking on a sharp, condescending edge. "Some of us in this neighborhood are interested in maintaining a certain standard. We don't want our property values dragged down by rustic, homemade eyesores." She gestured vaguely in the direction of his house, the word homemade dripping with contempt. It was a direct insult, a jab at the very thing he was most proud of, the home he had built with his own 2 hands. He could feel the familiar slow burn of anger beginning in his chest, an old feeling he hadn't experienced since his early days on the trading floor. He consciously reined it in. Getting angry was what she wanted. It would allow her to paint him as the unreasonable one. "My mailbox has been there for 20 years, Carol. It's well maintained, and it's part of the character of my home. It is not an eyesore, and it's certainly not dragging down anyone's property values," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "This isn't about standards. This is about you overstepping your authority." She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like glass breaking. "My authority? I am the president of this HOA. It is my job, my duty to enforce the covenants. You are in violation. If you refuse to comply, the fines will accrue. And I assure you, Albert, the board has the full authority to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines. You of all people, a banker," she said the word like it was a disease, "should understand how liens work." The threat was explicit now. It was no longer veiled. She was threatening his home, the sanctuary he had built, the cornerstone of his family's life, all over a mailbox. He looked at her, standing there in her pristine tennis whites, a petty tyrant on her marble porch, and he made a decision. He would not be intimidated. He would not be bullied. This was his home. and he would defend it. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Well, you do what you feel you have to do, Carol, and I'll do the same." He turned and walked away, the weight of her glare on his back, knowing that a war had just been declared. As Albert walked back to his house, he saw his next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, tending to his prize-winning roses. Arthur Henderson was an 80-year-old widower, a retired history professor who had lived in Oak Creek since the first foundations were laid. He was a quiet, gentle man with kind eyes and a wealth of local knowledge. He'd seen it all. Arthur watched Albert's retreat from Carol's fortress, a knowing, sad look on his face. "Trouble with the Queen?" "Well," he asked, his voice a soft, raspy whisper as Albert approached the low hedge separating their properties. Albert let out a humorless chuckle. "You could say that. She's invented a new rule about mailboxes and is threatening me with fines and a lien." Arthur sighed, snipping a dead rose from a bush with practiced care. "I'm not surprised. Be careful with that one, Albert. She's not just a busybody. She's vindictive." He leaned closer, lowering his voice even further, though no one else was around. "You remember the Millers? The young couple with the 2 little kids who lived in the corner house? They moved out about 6 months after Carol was elected." Albert nodded. He remembered them. They'd been a nice family. "I thought they got a job transfer." "That was the story," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the street warily. "The truth is, Carol made their lives a living hell. It started with their kids' basketball hoop. Then it was the color of their swing set. Fines, letters, threats. She called Child Protective Services on them once, anonymously, of course, claiming their yard was unsafe. It was all baseless, but you can imagine the stress. They were good people. They just couldn't take it anymore. They sold at a loss just to get away from her. The revelation landed like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just petty tyranny. This was a pattern of malicious, targeted harassment. Carol wasn't just a power tripper. She was a predator who drove families from their homes. "Why didn't anyone do anything?" Albert asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. Arthur looked down at the rose in his hand. "Fear, son. Most people here are like me. Older, on a fixed income. We can't afford a legal battle with the HOA. She knows that. She uses the association's funds, our money, as her own personal war chest. We just keep our heads down and hope we're not her next target." He looked up, his gaze meeting Albert's. "But you're different, Albert. You're not the type to keep your head down. Just be careful. She plays dirty." Arthur's warning echoed in Albert's mind as he sat in his home office, the offending letter on his desk next to the HOA binder. Fear. That's what she relied on. The fear of legal fees, the fear of liens, the fear of endless, draining conflict. She had turned the community association, a tool meant to preserve value and harmony, into her own private fiefdom, ruling through intimidation. Albert had spent his entire career analyzing risk, assessing character, and reading the fine print. He'd faced down corporate raiders and navigated market crashes. He wasn't about to be run out of his own home by a suburban despot with a god complex. His first move was to draft a response, not an angry email, but a formal, registered letter. He approached it like a legal correspondence. Because he knew that's where this was heading, he meticulously laid out his case. He quoted the original bylaw, attached a copy of the meeting minutes, where the proposed amendment was defeated, and respectfully stated that the violation notice was issued in error and without legal standing. He cited the HOA's own governing documents regarding the process for amending bylaws, highlighting that no such process had been followed. He concluded by stating that he would not be replacing his mailbox, would not be paying any fines, and that any attempt to place a lien on his property would be met with swift and decisive legal action, for which he would seek to recover all associated costs from the HOA. He made 2 copies. One for Carol, sent via certified mail with a return receipt requested. The other he sent to the HOA's secretary, a timid woman named Brenda, who seemed to live in Carol's shadow. He wanted to ensure there was a documented record that went beyond just the president. This was his opening move in what he was now mentally framing as a chess match. She had made a brash, aggressive opening, relying on intimidation. He was responding with a calm, calculated defense, building a fortress of logic and legal precedent. He sealed the envelopes, a grim sense of determination settling over him. He hadn't asked for this fight, but now that it was here, he intended to win it. The peace of his retirement was over. The battle for Oak Creek Estates had begun. The certified letter landed like a grenade in Carol Peterson's perfectly manicured world. Albert could almost picture her reaction. The initial shock, the sputtering indignation, the rage that a mere homeowner would dare to challenge her authority with such cold, formal precision. For 2 weeks, there was silence. No more letters appeared under his door. No passive-aggressive emails. Albert knew this wasn't an admission of defeat. It was the quiet before a storm. Carol was regrouping, planning her next attack. During this lull, Albert did what he did best: research. He wasn't just a banker. He was an investigator at heart. He spent his evenings poring over every document the HOA had ever published. He requested years' worth of financial statements, budget proposals, and board meeting minutes. At first, Brenda, the secretary, was hesitant, likely under orders from Carol. But Albert pointed to the specific bylaw that guaranteed every homeowner access to such records, and she reluctantly complied, emailing him a trove of PDF files. As he pieced through the numbers, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The HOA's legal expenditures had skyrocketed since Carol took office. There were huge, vaguely described payments to a law firm he'd never heard of: Peterson, Finch, Associates. A quick search revealed the firm was run by Carol's cousin, a clear conflict of interest. He saw a pattern of overspending on community beautification projects, all awarded to a single landscaping company, Elegant Environments, Inc., at rates nearly double the market average. Another search revealed the owner of Elegant Environments was Carol's sister-in-law. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was a family enterprise, funded by the mandatory dues of every resident in Oak Creek. She wasn't just a bully, she was a grifter, using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. The mailbox dispute was just a smokescreen, a way to assert dominance and distract from the real crime: the systematic looting of the community's treasury. His fight was no longer just about his own property. It was about defending his neighbors, whether they were too scared to defend themselves or simply unaware of how badly they were being fleeced. The next attack came not from the front, but from the flank. A new letter arrived, again on the thick, creamy cardstock. This one had nothing to do with his mailbox. Instead, it was a violation notice for his prized rose garden, the one his late wife Eleanor had planted years ago. According to Carol, citing Bylaw 12, Section A, Unapproved Flora, his Crimson Glory climbing roses were a non-native, invasive species. The letter demanded their immediate removal. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Eleanor's roses were his most cherished part of the garden, a living memory of his wife. They were also a classic, non-invasive hybrid that had been a staple of American gardens for a century. The claim was not just wrong, it was deliberately cruel. This was her response to his legal letter. She couldn't win on the facts of the mailbox, so she was changing the battlefield. She was making it personal. She was attacking a memory. Albert felt that cold anger rise again, sharper this time. He took a deep breath, picturing Eleanor's smiling face as she'd first planted those rose bushes. She would have been furious, but she also would have been pragmatic. "Don't let them see you sweat, Al," she used to say. "Use your head, not your temper." He went back to his desk. He documented the new letter, photographed the roses, and printed out a half-dozen articles from horticultural societies and university agricultural extensions, confirming the non-invasive nature of the Crimson Glory rose. He then called his old friend and personal lawyer, Marcus Vance. Marcus was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had handled Albert's corporate contracts for years. "Marcus," Albert said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I've got an HOA problem, but I think it's bigger than that. I think it's racketeering." He could hear Marcus sit up a little straighter on the other end of the line. "Racketeering, Al? That's a strong word." "I know what it means," Albert replied, "and I think it fits. I'm sending you a file. I need you to look at it. This isn't about roses anymore. This is about a crook. Marcus called back the next day. Al, you weren't kidding, he said, the usual levity gone from his voice. This is a mess. The conflict of interest with the law firm is blatant. The landscaping contracts are practically theft. This Peterson woman is running the HOA like a mob boss. He paused. The problem is, proving intent for something like criminal racketeering is a high bar. What we have right now is a solid case for a civil suit. We can sue the board for breach of fiduciary duty. We can get an injunction to stop the fines. We can force an independent audit. Albert listened, processing the options. A civil suit was the logical path, but he knew it would be a long, drawn-out battle. Carol would use the HOA's money, his neighbor's money, to fight him, bogging him down in depositions and motions for years, all while continuing her reign. It's a start, Albert said, but it's not enough. We need to cut the head off the snake. What about the harassment? The baseless violations? The threats? Mr. Henderson next door told me she drove a young family out of the neighborhood. That's useful, Marcus said. It establishes a pattern of behavior. If we can get other residents to come forward, to provide affidavits about their own experiences, we can build a much stronger case. We can paint a picture of targeted harassment and abuse of power that a judge will not ignore. But people have to be willing to speak up. And that was the crux of the problem. Carol ruled by fear. Getting people to put their names on a legal document against her would be like asking them to paint a target on their own backs. Albert knew he couldn't force them. He had to lead by example. He had to show them that she wasn't invincible. He had to absorb her attacks and stand his ground, becoming a shield for the rest of the community. All right, Albert said. Let's start with the injunction. Draft a cease and desist for this rose violation. Make it clear that any further baseless notices will be treated as targeted harassment. In the meantime, I'm going to do a little community outreach. He had a new mission: to find the other victims and convince them that there was strength in numbers. Albert started his community outreach subtly. He began taking longer walks in the evening, stopping to chat with neighbors who were out watering their lawns or getting their mail. He didn't lead with his legal battle. He started with simple, friendly conversation. He asked about their families, their gardens, their jobs. Inevitably, the conversation would drift to the neighborhood. And with just a little prompting, the topic of the HOA and Carol would surface. The stories started to trickle out, at first in hushed, nervous tones. One woman, a single mother named Sarah, told him about the $300 fine she'd received because her son had left his bicycle on the lawn for 2 hours. Another, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, had been forced to repaint his entire house because the shade of beige he'd used was, according to Carol, half a shade too dark on the approved color palette. Each story was another piece of the puzzle. Another example of Carol's petty, vindictive control. They all ended the same way. I just paid the fine. It wasn't worth the fight. Albert would listen patiently, nodding in sympathy. Then, he would share his own story about the mailbox and the roses. He showed them that he was fighting back, that he wasn't afraid. He explained in simple terms what he and Marcus had uncovered about the finances, about how their dues were being funneled to Carol's family. You could see the spark of indignation in their eyes, the slow burn of anger replacing the fear. "She's stealing from us?" Sarah asked, her voice a mix of shock and fury. "That's what it looks like," Albert confirmed. "But to prove it, and to stop her, we need to stand together. Marcus, my lawyer, says that if we can get a few people to write down their experiences, just a simple, signed statement, it would make our case immensely stronger." He wasn't asking them to storm the castle yet. He was just asking them to sharpen a single spear. He left each conversation with a simple promise. Think about it. You're not alone in this. He planted the seeds of rebellion, hoping they would take root. While Albert was quietly rallying the troops, Carol was escalating. The cease and desist letter from Marcus regarding the roses had clearly enraged her. Since she couldn't attack his property directly without risking a lawsuit, she resorted to a more insidious form of warfare. It started with noise. Her teenage son suddenly developed a passion for playing the drums, always in the garage that faced Albert's house, and always between the hours of 7 and 9 p.m., just as Albert was trying to relax. The playing was loud, erratic, and just within the limits of the city's noise ordinance. It was a calculated annoyance, impossible to formally complain about, but impossible to ignore. Then came the lights. Carol installed powerful, motion-activated floodlights on the side of her house, aimed directly at Albert's bedroom window. They were so sensitive that a passing moth would trigger them, flooding his room with blinding white light at all hours of the night. Sleep became a luxury. When Albert politely mentioned the lights to her one morning, she feigned surprise. "Oh dear, is it a bother? It's for security, you know. There have been reports of undesirables in the area." There had been no such reports. It was another lie, another turn of the screw. This was a war of attrition. She was trying to wear him down, to make his life so unpleasant that he would either give in or give up and move, just like the Miller family. Albert, however, was forged in a different kind of fire. He'd pulled all-nighters on trading deadlines fueled by nothing but stale coffee and sheer willpower. He could handle a little sleep deprivation. He bought blackout curtains. He bought noise-cancelling headphones. He documented every incident, noting the date, time, and duration in a detailed log. He was building his case, brick by painstaking brick. Every petty act of harassment she committed was just another nail she was hammering into her own coffin. He just had to be patient enough to let her finish the job. The turning point in his community outreach came from an unexpected source. One evening, as Albert was documenting another floodlight incident, his phone rang. It was Sarah, the single mother who had been fined for her son's bicycle. "Albert," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. "I got another one. A letter. My son's playhouse in the backyard is an unauthorized permanent structure. She wants it gone in a week or it's $1,000 fine." Her voice broke. "My father built that for him before he passed away. It's all my son has left of his grandpa." Albert's heart went out to her. This was Carol's modus operandi. Find what people cherish and attack it. "Don't do anything, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't respond to her. She can't do this. A child's playhouse is not a permanent structure. She's bluffing." "I can't afford a lawyer, Albert," she whispered. "You don't need one," he replied. "You've got mine. Marcus is handling this for all of us. All I need from you is to write down everything that's happened. The bike, the playhouse, any conversations you've had with her. Date it, sign it. Can you do that?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, he heard her take a deep, resolute breath. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I can. I'm done being afraid of that woman." Sarah's decision was the first crack in the dam. The next day, she told her story to Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen, emboldened by her courage, called Albert and agreed to write his own statement about the house paint. The news spread through the neighborhood's quiet grapevine. 2 more families called Albert that week. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope. They saw that Albert was weathering the storm, that he was fighting back not with anger, but with a calm, methodical strategy. He was their shield. And now, they were finally ready to hand him some swords. With a growing stack of signed affidavits, Marcus filed for the injunction and formally requested a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, citing the evidence of conflicts of interest and irregular spending. This was a direct declaration of war in a language Carol couldn't ignore. The HOA was served, and a court date was set. Carol's reaction was predictable. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive propaganda. In it, she lamented a frivolous and malicious lawsuit filed by a disgruntled resident who was unwilling to abide by the community standards that protect all of our property values. She claimed the lawsuit was a waste of the HOA's precious resources she would now have to spend on legal fees to defend the integrity of our wonderful community. To paint him as the villain who was costing everyone money. But her strategy backfired. The neighbors who had spoken with Albert knew the truth. They saw the email for what it was. The desperate act of a cornered animal. The email, in fact, prompted 2 more homeowners to contact Albert, offering their support. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. It was no longer just Albert versus Carol. It was becoming the community versus the board. The upcoming court hearing for the injunction would be the first real test of strength. Marcus was confident. She has no legal ground to stand on with these violations, Al. The judge will see right through it. The real fight will be getting the audit approved. She'll have her cousin, the lawyer, there, and they'll argue it's an overreach. Let them, Albert said. The more they fight to hide the books, the more guilty they look. He was preparing for the hearing like he would for a major corporate negotiation. He and Marcus went over every detail, every possible argument. He felt a familiar thrill, the same one he'd felt when closing a complex deal. Carol thought she was just harassing a retired old man. She had no idea she had picked a fight with a lion who had spent 40 years ruling a much more dangerous jungle than Oak Creek Estates. The day of the hearing arrived. The small courtroom was surprisingly full. Sarah was there. Mr. Chen was there. A half-dozen other residents from Oak Creek had shown up, sitting quietly in the back rows. They weren't there to testify. Not yet. But their presence was a silent statement of support. A quiet rebellion. Carol swept in with her cousin lawyer in tow, dressed in a severe navy blue suit, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She visibly stiffened when she saw the contingent of neighbors, her eyes darting around the room, taking a mental tally of the traitors. The hearing began. Carol's lawyer was slick and condescending. He portrayed Albert as a troublemaker, a man with a personal vendetta who refused to follow simple rules. He dismissed the violations as standard HOA enforcement. When Marcus got his turn, he was methodical. He didn't raise his voice. He simply presented the facts. He showed the judge the bylaw about the mailbox and the meeting minutes where it was voted down. He presented the horticultural evidence about the non-invasive nature of the roses. He submitted Sarah's affidavit about the playhouse. With each piece of evidence, the judge's expression grew more and more stern. "Ma'am," the judge said, addressing Carol directly, "this court is not a tool for you to settle personal grudges with your neighbors. The violations before me appear to be entirely without merit." He granted the injunction immediately, ordering the HOA to cease all current and future violation notices against Albert and Sarah, pending a full review. Then Marcus moved on to the request for an audit. As predicted, Carol's lawyer fought it tooth and nail. "It's an invasion of privacy, a fishing expedition," he blustered. The judge looked at the evidence of the exorbitant legal fees being paid to the lawyer standing right in front of him. He looked at the non-competitive landscaping bids awarded to Carol's sister-in-law. "I think, under the circumstances," the judge said, his voice laced with ice, "a little fishing is entirely appropriate. Motion to compel an independent audit is granted. The court will appoint the auditor." It was a total victory. Carol sat stunned, her face pale with fury. She had been publicly rebuked, her authority challenged and overridden. As they filed out of the courtroom, Albert caught her eye. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a gesture of triumph, it was a promise. This was only the beginning. The court's ruling sent a shockwave through Oak Creek Estates. The news of Carol's public defeat spread like wildfire. The injunction meant she could no longer use petty violations as a weapon. The court-ordered audit meant her financial shenanigans were about to be exposed to the light of day. For the first time, her aura of invincibility was shattered. The balance of power had shifted. More neighbors began to approach Albert, no longer in hushed whispers, but openly on the street, shaking his hand, thanking him. They shared their own stories of Carol's abuse. A floodgate of repressed frustration finally bursting open. The collection of affidavits grew, creating a damning dossier of her reign of terror. But Albert knew Carol wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. A cornered predator is at its most dangerous. He expected retaliation, and he knew it would be uglier and more desperate than anything she had tried before. He warned Marcus, "She's going to do something stupid. Something criminal." Marcus agreed. "Keep your guard up, Al. And for God's sake, get some security cameras. Good ones." Albert had already thought of it. As a man who appreciated technology and security, he didn't just buy a simple doorbell camera. He invested in a state-of-the-art, multi-camera, high-definition system that covered every inch of his property's perimeter. He installed them himself, running the wires with the same precision he'd used to build the house, ensuring there were no blind spots. He focused one camera with a clear, unobstructed view of his beloved pool and patio. The system recorded 24/7 to a secure, cloud-based server. He felt a little foolish, turning his peaceful home into a surveillance outpost. But Arthur Henderson's story about the Millers and the false child abuse report haunted him. He knew Carol was capable of anything. He hoped the cameras would be nothing more than a deterrent, a silent warning. He had no idea they were about to become the star witness in a criminal investigation. The weeks following the court hearing were deceptively quiet. The drum practice stopped. The floodlights were mysteriously re-aimed. Carol was a ghost, never seen, never heard from. Albert knew this was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. The court-appointed auditor was at work, and the clock was ticking for her. She was undoubtedly shredding documents and cooking books, trying to cover her tracks. Albert used the time to strengthen his own position. He and Marcus worked with the growing coalition of residents to prepare for the next HOA general meeting. Their goal was to formally present the evidence and call for a vote of no confidence to remove Carol and her cronies from the board. They drafted motions, prepared statements, and organized a proxy voting system for those still too intimidated to attend in person. The community was transforming. Neighbors who had barely spoken for years were now meeting in living rooms, strategizing, united by a common enemy. There was a sense of empowerment, of taking back their community. Albert, the reluctant general, found himself leading a full-blown suburban insurgency. Yet, a knot of unease remained in his gut. It was all too quiet. This wasn't Carol's style. She was a creature of chaos and confrontation. This silence was unnatural. It was the eerie calm in the eye of a hurricane. He found himself checking his camera feeds more often than he cared to admit, scanning the perimeter, watching the shadows. He felt like a soldier on watch, waiting for an attack he knew was coming, but with no idea from which direction. The waiting was the hardest part. He just hoped that when she finally made her move, he would be ready for it. The attack came on a Tuesday night. It was late, close to 2 a.m. The neighborhood was dark and silent. A nondescript white work van with no company markings rolled slowly down the street and parked a few houses down from Albert's. The streetlights flickered on the side of the van, revealing nothing distinctive. Two figures, dressed in dark hoodies and pants, their faces obscured by shadows and masks, emerged from the van. They moved quickly and quietly, carrying heavy-duty buckets and bags. They slipped through the hedge on the side of Albert's property. A spot he had ironically noted was a minor blind spot between two camera zones. They were professionals, or at least they were trying to act like it. They moved with a purpose, heading straight for the backyard. The high-definition, night vision camera aimed at the pool captured the scene in stark, ghostly detail. The two figures stood at the edge of the pristine, moonlit water. For a moment, they just stood there. And then, with methodical efficiency, they began their work of destruction. They opened the bags of quick-setting concrete mix and dumped them into the deep end of the pool. Dust plumed into the night air. Then came the buckets, filled with water from Albert's own spigot, poured directly onto the powder. They used a long pole they'd brought with them to stir the mixture, creating a thick, grey slurry that began to sink and spread across the pool's smooth plaster floor. It was an act of pure, unadulterated vandalism. A calculated violation designed to inflict maximum financial and emotional damage. They were not just damaging a pool. They were poisoning an oasis. They were pouring concrete on a lifetime of happy memories. And 1,000 miles away, on a secure cloud server, every second of their malicious act was being recorded in crystal-clear 4K resolution. Albert woke the next morning to the familiar smell of coffee and the soft light of dawn. His routine was sacrosanct. Coffee, newspaper, a walk out to the patio to check the pool's chemical levels. It was a moment of peace before the day began. But that morning, peace was shattered. As he slid open the glass door, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. His beautiful, crystal-clear pool was gone. In its place was a murky grey pond with a hideous, spreading mass of hardened sludge at the bottom. A small mountain of empty concrete bags and buckets lay discarded on the pristine deck tiles. For a long moment, Albert just stood there, motionless, a feeling of violation so profound it left him breathless. This was his sanctuary. His wife's garden surrounded it. His children had grown up in it. And now it was desecrated. The cold, calculated anger returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the slow burn of indignation. It was the flash freeze of pure, focused rage. He didn't storm over to Carol's house. He didn't scream or yell. His training, his entire life's experience, took over. He pulled out his phone, his hand steady. His first call was not to Marcus. It was to the police. He calmly reported a major act of vandalism to his property. His second action was to go to his office computer. He accessed the security camera footage from the night before. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled back to 2 a.m. And there it was. The white van. The two figures. The bags. The buckets. The methodical destruction. He zoomed in on the footage. The figures were masked, their faces hidden, but one of them, as he turned to leave, snagged his hoodie on a rose thorn from Eleanor's climbing bush. The hood pulled back for a split second, and the camera caught a clear profile of his face under the moonlight. Albert didn't recognize him. But then he zoomed in on the white van. On the side door, faint and barely visible but unmistakable on the 4K footage, was the ghost of a removed decal. You could just make out the lettering, Elegant Environments, Inc., Carol's sister-in-law's company. Environments Candidi. Environments Candidi. He had her. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers, a veteran sergeant and a younger patrolman, looked at the scene with grim faces. This was far beyond typical teenage mischief. The sergeant, a man named Miller, listened patiently as Albert explained the situation. He didn't mention the HOA dispute at first. He just laid out the facts of the vandalism. "This is felony-level damage, sir," Sergeant Miller said, looking at the solidifying mass in the pool. "We're talking tens of thousands of dollars to fix this. Maybe more. You might have to jackhammer the whole thing out." Albert nodded. "I know, but I think I can help you with your investigation." He led the officers into his office and played the security footage for them on his large monitor. He showed them the van, the figures, and the crucial moment where the man's face was revealed. Then he showed them the zoom-in on the faint logo of Elegant Environments Incorporate. "The owner of that company," Albert said, his voice flat and even, "is the sister-in-law of my HOA president, Carol Peterson. Mrs. Peterson and I are currently involved in a contentious legal dispute." Sergeant Miller's eyes sharpened. He looked from the screen to Albert. The pieces were clicking into place. This wasn't a random act. This was a targeted attack. "Do you have the address for this company?" he asked. Albert had already looked it up. He handed the officer a slip of paper. "And I have the name of the man whose face was caught on camera," Albert added. He had spent the time while waiting for the police, running a reverse image search on the screenshot, cross-referencing it with social media profiles linked to Elegant Environments. It didn't take long. "His name is Rick. He's listed as a foreman on their website. And according to his public social media page, he's Carol Peterson's nephew." The younger officer let out a low whistle. Sergeant Miller just nodded slowly, a grim look on his face. "Sir," he said to Albert, "I think you've just done most of our job for us. We'll be paying a visit to Elegant Environments and Mr. Rick." The investigation proceeded with surprising speed. With the clear video evidence and the direct family connections, the police had more than enough to secure a warrant. They picked up Rick at his home that afternoon. Faced with a 4K video of himself destroying a pool and the prospect of a felony conviction, he folded like a cheap suit. He confessed to everything. He told the detectives that his aunt, Carol Peterson, had hired him and another employee to do the job. She'd paid them $5,000 in cash. She'd called it a lesson for a troublemaker who was trying to ruin the neighborhood. She had planned it, funded it, and directed it. Rick, hoping for leniency, agreed to give a full, signed statement implicating his aunt. He even told them where she'd gotten the cash. From a recent special assessment fee she'd levied on the entire community for emergency tree removal, a service that was never performed. It was all there: conspiracy to commit property damage, criminal mischief, and, tied to the special assessment, felony embezzlement and fraud. Late that afternoon, Sergeant Miller called Albert. "We have a full confession," he said. He gave up Carol Peterson. "The district attorney's office is drafting an arrest warrant for her as we speak. We'll likely execute it tomorrow morning." A wave of relief washed over Albert, so profound it almost buckled his knees. The waiting was over. The other shoe had finally dropped. It was a hollow victory, though. He looked out his window at the ruined pool, a grey scar in his beautiful yard. Justice was coming, but the damage was done. Still, he knew this was the end of her reign. He called Marcus, then Sarah, then Mr. Henderson, to share the news. The quiet rebellion of Oak Creek Estates was about to witness the public fall of its queen, and it was going to be spectacular. The next morning, the neighborhood was treated to a spectacle it would not soon forget. At precisely 8:30 a.m., just as people were leaving for work and getting their kids on the school bus, 2 police cruisers rolled silently down the street and parked in front of Carol Peterson's oversized McMansion. Sergeant Miller and another detective walked up the grand stone walkway and rang the doorbell. A moment later, Carol answered. Dressed in a silk robe, a coffee cup in her hand, her expression of annoyance at the early call quickly curdled into one of disbelief and then horror as Sergeant Miller presented her with the arrest warrant. Her voice, usually so loud and commanding at HOA meetings, was reduced to a sputtering squeak. She denied everything, of course. She called it a misunderstanding, a lie fabricated by a disgruntled employee and her crazy neighbor. But her protests were useless. The evidence was overwhelming. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, stood on their porches, and stopped their cars in the middle of the street to watch. The woman who had terrorized them over the color of their trim and the height of their grass was being handcuffed on her own marble steps. As they led her to the cruiser, a weeping, disheveled mess, she saw Albert standing on his lawn, watching, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "You!" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns. "You did this. You'll pay for this." Albert didn't react. He just stood there, a silent, immovable witness to her self-inflicted downfall. He didn't feel triumph, or even satisfaction. He just felt a profound sense of weary, righteous finality. The witch was dead. Now the hard work of rebuilding the kingdom could begin. Carol's arrest was the talk of the town. The local news picked up the story. HOA president, arrested in bizarre pool vandalism and embezzlement scheme. Her mugshot, a tear-streaked, puffy-faced image of shocked entitlement, was plastered everywhere. She made bail, of course, posting a bond using what was likely the last of her liquid assets. But she returned to the neighborhood, a pariah. The power she once wielded was gone, replaced by shame and notoriety. The HOA board she had controlled crumbled overnight. Her 2 cronies resigned immediately, sending out a panicked email claiming they had no knowledge of her financial or criminal activities. An emergency meeting was called. This time, the community center was packed. There were no empty seats. Albert, who had been asked to preside over the meeting, stood at the front of the room. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there to lead. He calmly and factually laid out everything that had happened. The financial malfeasance uncovered by the preliminary audit, the pattern of harassment, and the criminal charges against Carol. He presented a plan, drafted with Marcus's help, to dissolve the current board, elect an interim council, and hire a forensic accountant to conduct a full, exhaustive audit to determine the true extent of the financial damage. For the first time in years, the residents of Oak Creek Estates felt like they had a voice. Hands went up. Questions were asked. Ideas were shared. By the end of the meeting, a new interim board had been elected. Sarah, the single mother, was the new president. Mr. Chen was the treasurer. And Albert, despite his protests that he just wanted his quiet retirement back, agreed to serve as a special advisor. The atmosphere was electric. The fear that had blanketed the community for years had finally lifted. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The forensic audit began, and what it uncovered was even worse than Albert had initially suspected. Carol had been systematically plundering the HOA's reserve funds for years. She'd paid for lavish vacations, disguised as fact-finding trips for community management. She'd used HOA funds to pay her own property taxes and her son's car insurance through the sham landscaping and law firms. The total amount of embezzled money was staggering, close to $250,000. All of this information was turned over to the district attorney, adding even more felony charges to her rapidly growing list. Meanwhile, the legal case against her for the pool vandalism was ironclad. Her nephew, Rick, had become the state's star witness in exchange for a plea deal that would likely keep him out of prison. Carol's high-priced new criminal defense attorney could do little but delay the inevitable. In the neighborhood, change was everywhere. The new interim board, led by Sarah, worked with the community to rewrite the bylaws. They stripped out the vague, subjective rules Carol had used as weapons and replaced them with clear, common-sense guidelines. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. They planned a neighborhood barbecue, the first in years. Albert, for his part, focused on his own recovery project. The process of repairing the pool was a nightmare. A demolition crew had to come in with jackhammers and painstakingly break up the hardened concrete. A process that took over a week and filled the air with dust and noise. The entire plaster surface of the pool had to be stripped down and redone. The cost was astronomical, but Albert knew his homeowner's insurance would cover most of it, and the rest would be paid back through court-ordered restitution from Carol. He watched the workers every day, a grim reminder of how far she had been willing to go. As Carol's legal troubles mounted, her financial situation grew desperate. Her assets were frozen as part of the criminal investigation. Her husband, a man who had clearly enjoyed the fruits of her embezzling, had quietly filed for divorce and moved out. She was isolated, toxic, and running out of money. Her expensive lawyers demanded a hefty retainer to handle the complex fraud and embezzlement charges. She was hemorrhaging cash. Desperate, she decided to leverage the one major asset she had left in her name, her gaudy McMansion. She needed a home equity line of credit, and she needed it fast, before the courts could place a lien on the property as part of the criminal case. She was in a race against time. She applied to several large national banks but was quickly turned down. The news of her arrest had made her a high-risk applicant. In her panic, she turned to a smaller local institution, the Oak Creek Community Bank. It had a reputation for being more flexible, for working with local residents. She filled out the online application, fudging some numbers and conveniently omitting the pending felony charges. She just needed a loan officer to push it through quickly, before the underwriters did too deep a dive. A few days later, she received a call. Her preliminary application looked promising, but due to the size of the loan she was requesting, the final approval would need to come from the bank's president. She was asked to come in for a meeting the following week. Carol was ecstatic. She saw it as a sign, a glimmer of hope. She thought if she could just use her charm, her powers of persuasion, on the bank president in person, she could secure the funds she needed to save herself. She had no idea who the president of the Oak Creek Community Bank was. She didn't know that it was a semi-retired position, held by a respected figure who still liked to keep a hand in the business he had built. She had no idea that the man she was about to ask for a $500,000 loan was Albert. The day of the meeting, Albert sat in his large, comfortable office on the top floor of the bank, a place he now only visited 2 or 3 times a week. The file on his desk contained Carol Peterson's loan application. He had been alerted by the chief loan officer, a man who knew about Albert's neighborhood troubles, the moment her application had come in. They had done their due diligence. They had run a full background check, which immediately flagged the pending felony charges she had forgotten to disclose. The application was already marked for denial on grounds of fraud, but Albert had instructed them to schedule the meeting anyway. He wanted to see her. He wanted to look her in the eye one last time, not as a neighbor, but as the final gatekeeper of her financial ruin. He wasn't a vindictive man by nature, but what Carol had done was so far beyond the pale, so malicious, that he felt she deserved this one final face-to-face reckoning. He heard a knock on the door. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Henderson, a Ms. Carol Peterson, is here to see you." Albert smiled grimly. He'd always used his middle name, Henderson, professionally. It was a small nod to his mother's family. To the outside world, he was A. Henderson, the bank president. To his neighbors, he was just Albert. It was a detail Carol had never bothered to learn. "Send her in," he said, his voice calm. The stage was set for the final act of the drama. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and waited. He was no longer the retired man in his garden. He was the president, in his seat of power, and judgment was about to be rendered. Carol Peterson entered the office with a practiced air of confidence, a stark contrast to the shrieking mess the police had dragged from her home weeks earlier. She had meticulously prepared for this moment, her hair perfectly styled, her suit expensive and tailored, her smile a carefully constructed facade of success and trustworthiness. She scanned the office, taking in the mahogany desk, the leather chairs, the expansive view of the town square. This was a place of power, and she intended to appeal to it. Her eyes, however, skimmed right over the man behind the desk, her brain not immediately making the connection. In this context, in this seat of authority, he was not the quiet, stubborn retiree from down the street. He was simply the obstacle she needed to overcome. "Mr. Henderson, thank you so much for seeing me," she began, her voice smooth as butter as she extended a hand. "Carol Peterson, it's a pleasure." Albert did not stand. He did not take her hand. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat, Miss Peterson," he said. The use of his professional name, Henderson, and the formal address seemed to satisfy her expectations. She settled into the chair, crossing her legs elegantly and placing her expensive briefcase on her lap. She launched into her well-rehearsed speech, a tale of a successful small business consultant, her fictitious LinkedIn profession, who was looking to leverage some home equity for a strategic investment opportunity. She was charming, articulate, and utterly full of lies. She spoke of market trends and growth potential, using business jargon she'd likely picked up from a cable news show. Albert listened in complete silence, his face an unreadable mask. He let her talk for nearly 10 minutes, letting her spin her web of deceit, giving her all the rope she needed. He watched her, a predator in her natural habitat, completely unaware that she was the one caught in the trap. When Carol finally finished her breathless presentation, she leaned forward with a conspiratorial smile. "So, you see, it's a very time-sensitive opportunity. The paperwork is all in order, and I'm prepared to move forward immediately. I was told my application just needed your final signature." She was trying to create a sense of urgency, to rush him, to prevent any deeper scrutiny. She was treating him like any other bureaucratic hurdle. Albert still said nothing. He slowly opened the file in front of him, the one with her name on it. He took out a single sheet of paper from the top and slid it across the polished surface of the desk toward her. "Is this your signature, Miss Peterson?" he asked, his voice quiet. Carol glanced at the paper. It was the application's declaration page, where she had sworn that all the information provided was true and accurate, and that she had no pending legal judgments or criminal charges against her. "Yes, of course, that's my signature," she said, a hint of irritation in her voice. Albert picked up another document from the file. It was a printout of the public docket from the county court, listing in stark black and white the multiple felony charges she was facing: grand larceny, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit property damage. He slid that paper across the desk to sit beside the first. "That's interesting," Albert said, his voice still deceptively calm, "because this public record seems to indicate that you are, in fact, facing several rather serious criminal charges. Charges you failed to disclose on a legally binding financial document. That's a federal offense, you know. Bank fraud." The color drained from Carol's face. Her practiced smile faltered, twitching at the corners. Her eyes darted from the court document to Albert's face, a flicker of confusion and panic in their depths. She still hadn't fully recognized him. I don't understand," she stammered. This is a mistake. My lawyer is handling that. It's a personal dispute, a misunderstanding with a neighbor." "A misunderstanding," Albert repeated, the words hanging in the air like icicles. He finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, and for the first time, he let the cold, hard anger show in his eyes. He looked directly at her, and in that moment, in the stark light of the office, the veil of context dropped, and she finally saw him, really saw him. Her neighbor, Albert, the man whose life she had tried to systematically dismantle. Her jaw went slack. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. The carefully constructed reality she had built for this meeting shattered into a million pieces. The confident businesswoman evaporated, replaced by the cornered, desperate criminal. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a single word, but it was filled with a universe of dawning horror, confusion, and utter disbelief. The sheer cosmic irony of the situation was finally crashing down on her. The man whose pool she'd filled with concrete, the man she'd tried to ruin, was the very person who held the key to her last-ditch financial salvation, and she had just walked into his office and committed bank fraud directly to his face. "Me," Albert confirmed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Imagine your surprise. You come into my bank, asking for my money. After you hired your nephew to destroy my home, you lie on a federal document, committing a felony in my office. You have a spectacular amount of nerve, Carol. I'll give you that." He stood up, towering over her, his presence filling the room. He was no longer just her neighbor. He was the embodiment of all the consequences she had so arrogantly believed she could escape. "Your loan application is, of course, denied," he said, his voice dripping with ice. "But this meeting isn't over. I've already forwarded your fraudulent application to our legal department, who are, in turn, forwarding it to the district attorney's office and the FBI. I imagine they'll be very interested in adding bank fraud to your list of charges." Carol just stared at him, her mind completely unable to process the cataclysmic turn of events. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The tables hadn't just been turned, they had been picked up, shattered into kindling, and set on fire. She was utterly and completely ruined. Albert walked over to his office door and opened it. 2 uniformed police officers were standing in the hallway. Sergeant Miller was one of them. He'd been waiting, just as Albert had arranged. "Sergeant," Albert said, his voice ringing with authority, "this is Carol Peterson. I believe you know her. She's just attempted to commit bank fraud in my presence. I'd like to press charges." Sergeant Miller nodded grimly. He and the other officer stepped into the room. Carol looked at the police, then back at Albert. A wild, desperate look in her eyes. The mask of superiority was gone forever, replaced by raw, primal fear. She pleaded, her voice a ragged whisper. "Please, you can't." "I can," Albert said, his voice devoid of any pity. "And I am. You made this happen, Carol, every bit of it. You built this cage for yourself. One violation notice, one lie, one bag of concrete at a time." The officers moved towards her. She didn't shriek or fight this time. There was no fire left in her. She was just a hollowed-out shell of arrogance, defeated and broken. As they cuffed her for the second time in as many months, her gaze locked with Albert's. He saw no remorse in her eyes, no understanding of the harm she had caused. All he saw was the bewildered fury of a tyrant who simply could not comprehend how her world had been so completely and utterly dismantled by a man she had dismissed as a nobody. The war was over. The epilogue to Carol Peterson's reign of terror was written not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, methodical language of the law. With the added charge of bank fraud, her chances of any plea deal evaporated. The evidence against her was a mountain video footage, a confessing co-conspirator, a forensic audit trail of embezzlement, and now a federal charge personally witnessed by the bank president. Her trial was short. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. She was found guilty on all counts. The judge, citing her complete lack of remorse and the malicious, premeditated nature of her crimes against the community, sentenced her to a term in state prison that would ensure she wouldn't be troubling any neighbors for a very long time. Her McMansion was seized and sold at auction to cover the massive court-ordered restitution she owed to the HOA and to Albert. The house was bought by a young family with 3 children, who immediately tore down the ostentatious stone lions and put up a basketball hoop. The sight of it made Albert smile every time he walked by. The HOA, under Sarah's leadership, was completely reformed. The stolen funds were slowly being replenished by the sale of Carol's assets. The bylaws were now a simple, fair, and transparent document. The community started holding monthly potlucks in the park. People were talking to each other again. The cloud of fear had been replaced by a genuine sense of community. The quiet rebellion had succeeded. A new era had dawned for Oak Creek Estates. Albert's pool was eventually restored to its former glory. The day the workers finished refilling it with crystal-clear water, he sat on his patio, a cup of coffee in his hand, and looked at the sparkling turquoise surface. The scar was gone, but the memory remained. It was a reminder of the fight he never wanted, but a fight he was proud to have finished. His quiet retirement wasn't quite what he had envisioned. He was now a reluctant local hero, the man who had stood up to the bully and won. He remained an advisor to the new HOA board, his wisdom and steady hand guiding them as they rebuilt the trust Carol had shattered. He found, to his surprise, that he enjoyed it. He had spent his life building a career and a fortune. Now, he was building a community. He never sought the conflict, but through it, he had found a new sense of purpose. He had reconnected with his neighbors and forged new friendships, bonds that were stronger for having been tested in the fire of Carol's tyranny. Arthur Henderson, his wise, elderly neighbor, no longer tended his roses with a fearful glance over his shoulder. He'd even installed a small, cheerful garden gnome on his lawn, a tiny, defiant symbol of their newfound freedom. "A toast," Arthur said one evening, raising a glass of iced tea as he and Albert sat between their yards. "To quiet neighbors, good fences, and the righteous fall of tyrants." Albert clinked his glass against Arthur's. "I'll drink to that," he said, a genuine, peaceful smile on his face. The war was over, the peace was won, and his sanctuary was finally, truly, his own again. The forensic audit, in its final report, laid bare the full, shocking scope of Carol's kleptocracy. It was a masterclass in petty fraud. The landscaping company owned by her sister-in-law, Elegant Environments, Inc., had billed the HOA for services never rendered: phantom tree trimmings, non-existent seasonal flower plantings, and monthly soil enrichment programs that were pure fiction. The invoices were vague and inflated, approved without question by Carol and her two board cronies. The cousins' law firm, Peterson, Finch, Associates, had billed the HOA for thousands of hours of legal consultation that amounted to nothing more than drafting threatening letters to residents. They had even billed the association for the time it took to unsuccessfully defend Carol's ridiculous violation notices in court, essentially forcing the community to pay for its own persecution. This detailed report was presented at a special community-wide meeting. As the forensic accountant walked the residents through the line items, a stunned silence fell over the room, punctuated by occasional gasps and angry murmurs. People saw, in black and white, how their hard-earned money had been systematically siphoned off to fund Carol's lifestyle. It was one thing to hear rumors of mismanagement. It was another to see the cold, hard proof of years of brazen theft. This report became a key exhibit in the prosecution's case, transforming her from a mere neighborhood bully into a calculated long-term fraudster, which heavily influenced the judge's harsh sentencing. The community, seeing the sheer scale of the betrayal, voted unanimously to pursue a civil case against not just Carol, but also her sister-in-law and cousin, to claw back every stolen penny. The story of Oak Creek Estates and the downfall of its HOA queen became a cautionary tale in the surrounding towns. A reporter from the local newspaper wrote a long-form feature on the whole ordeal, interviewing Albert, Sarah, and other residents. The article, titled "The Tyrant of Turquoise Pool," went viral locally. It served as a wake-up call for residents in other HOAs. People started paying closer attention to their own boards, requesting financial documents, and asking tough questions at meetings. Albert began receiving emails and phone calls from people in other neighborhoods who were dealing with their own Carol Petersons. They asked for advice, for guidance. Reluctantly at first, Albert found himself becoming a sort of pro bono consultant on HOA governance. He created a simple one-page guide: know your rights, check the books, and stand together. and would email it to anyone who asked. He explained the importance of reading the bylaws, of attending meetings, and of the power of a united front. He stressed that most HOA board members were good, well-intentioned volunteers, but that unchecked power, even in a small community, could corrupt. He never wanted to be an activist, but he felt a responsibility to share the lessons he had learned. His personal battle had inadvertently sparked a small, grassroots movement for transparency and accountability in suburban governance. His quiet stand had empowered hundreds of others to do the same, ensuring that other communities wouldn't have to suffer the way his had. One of the most satisfying outcomes for Albert was witnessing the transformation of his neighbors. Sarah, once a timid single mother, afraid of making waves, had blossomed into a confident and capable leader. She ran the new HOA with a firm but fair hand, emphasizing communication and consensus. She instituted a monthly newsletter to keep everyone informed and an open forum at the beginning of each meeting where residents could voice concerns without fear of retribution. Mr. Chen, the new treasurer, took to his role with an eagle eye, creating a transparent, easy-to-understand budget that was posted online for all to see. He set up a system of checks and balances, requiring dual signatures for any expenditure over $100, ensuring no one person could ever wield that kind of financial power again. Even Arthur Henderson found a new role. His deep knowledge of the neighborhood's history made him the de facto head of the new Architectural and Historical Review Committee, a body created to preserve the character of the community in a positive way, rather than to punish homeowners. They worked to help people with renovations, offering guidance instead of issuing fines. The community that Carol had tried to rule through division and fear was now stronger and more cohesive than it had ever been. People were talking, collaborating, and taking collective pride in their neighborhood. It was a testament to the idea that a community is not just a collection of houses, but a network of people. And when those people stand together, they are unbreakable. The legal process to recover the stolen funds was long and arduous, but Marcus Vance pursued it with the tenacity of a bulldog. He filed suits against the landscaping company and the law firm, proving they were not just beneficiaries, but active participants in the fraudulent schemes. Faced with their own legal jeopardy, both Carol's sister-in-law and cousin settled out of court. They agreed to pay back a significant portion of the money they had received over the years. This, combined with the proceeds from the sale of Carol's house, meant that the Oak Creek Estates HOA was able to recover nearly 80% of the $250,000 she had embezzled. It was a stunning legal victory. The new board decided to put the recovered funds to a community vote. They could have simply refunded it to the homeowners, but instead, they proposed a series of long-neglected community improvement projects. They voted to resurface the community tennis courts, which had fallen into disrepair. They voted to upgrade the small playground with new, safer equipment. And, in a move that brought a particular smile to Albert's face, they voted to plant a new grove of oak trees at the neighborhood entrance, a symbol of their renewed strength and rootedness. The money that Carol had stolen to enrich herself was now being used to enrich the very community she had abused. It was a perfect karmic reversal, turning the fruits of her greed into a legacy of positive change for everyone. Months after the trial, as life in Oak Creek Estates settled into its new, peaceful rhythm, Albert received an unexpected letter. It was from the Miller family, the young couple Arthur Henderson had told him about, the ones who had been driven out by Carol's harassment years ago. Someone in the neighborhood had forwarded them the newspaper article. In a heartfelt handwritten note, they thanked Albert for what he had done. "We never thought anyone would stand up to her," the letter read. "We felt so alone and powerless. Reading about your courage and how you brought the community together gave us a sense of closure we never thought we'd have. Thank you for getting justice, not just for yourself, but for all the families she hurt, including ours." Tucked inside the letter was a photograph of their two smiling children, a bit older now, standing in front of their new home in a different state. Reading their words, Albert felt a deeper sense of satisfaction than even the guilty verdict had provided. His fight hadn't just been about a mailbox or a pool. It had been about reclaiming a fundamental sense of safety and decency. It was about ensuring that no other family would have their peace shattered by the whims of a petty tyrant. He placed the letter and the photograph on his desk, next to the picture of his late wife, Eleanor. He knew she would have been proud. He had defended not just his home, but the very idea of what a home should be, a place of safety, peace, and community. He had fought the good fight, and in the end, that was a legacy worth more than any bank balance. Albert's relationship with the local police department also changed. Sergeant Miller made a point to stop by one afternoon, not on official business, but just to talk. He sat with Albert on the newly repaired patio, sipping a cold lemonade. "You know," Miller said, looking at the pristine pool, "in 20 years on the force, I've seen a lot of neighborhood disputes. Most of them end in shouting matches or, at worst, someone getting a restraining order. I've never seen one end with a multi-count felony conviction and an FBI investigation." He shook his head in amazement. "You handled this like a professional. The way you documented everything, the cameras, the financial research. You built an airtight case for us. You made our job easy." Albert shrugged. "I just did what I knew how to do. I treat every problem like a balance sheet. You find the inaccuracies. You trace them back to the source, and you correct them." Miller chuckled. "Well, if you ever get tired of banking, the detective squad could use a guy like you." The sergeant's visit was more than just a courtesy. It established a new level of trust between the community and law enforcement. The residents of Oak Creek saw that the police had taken their concerns seriously and acted decisively. It fostered a sense of partnership, reminding everyone that the rule of law was not just for major crimes, but was there to protect the quality of life in their own backyards. It was another positive ripple effect from a single, principled stand. The fall of Carol Peterson had a profound, if unspoken, effect on her own family. Her ex-husband moved across the state and was never heard from again. Her son, the aspiring drummer, went to live with his father, his garage band days in Oak Creek an embarrassing memory. The most direct consequence, however, was felt by her relatives who had been complicit in her schemes. Her nephew Rick, who had dumped the concrete, received a lenient sentence of probation and community service in exchange for his testimony. But he was saddled with a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life. He lost his job and struggled to find work, a permanent casualty of his aunt's greed. Her sister-in-law's company, Elegant Environments, Inc., was ruined. Once the civil suit was settled and the news of their involvement in the fraud became public, their reputation was destroyed. Clients cancelled contracts, and the business folded within a year. Her cousin's law firm also suffered immensely. While he avoided criminal charges, the public exposure of his unethical billing practices and conflict of interest led to a formal investigation by the State Bar Association. He was censured, and his practice withered. Carol's corrupt enterprise had not just destroyed her own life, it had created a vortex of destruction that pulled down everyone she had dragged into her schemes. It was a stark lesson in how toxicity can spread, and how cutting out the source is sometimes the only way to save the entire system. One of Albert's personal projects after the chaos subsided was to create a sort of community archive. He scanned and digitized all the old HOA documents, meeting minutes, and bylaws, creating a searchable online database accessible to all residents. He believed that easy access to information was the best defense against future abuses of power. He wanted to ensure that the institutional memory of what had happened would not be lost. During this process, he stumbled upon the original articles of incorporation for the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association from 40 years ago. The language was simple, idealistic. It spoke of fostering a spirit of community, promoting neighborly conduct, and preserving the natural beauty of the area for the enjoyment of all. There was no mention of fines, liens, or punitive actions. It was a document born of optimism and a shared vision. Carol had twisted that vision into something ugly and authoritarian. She had taken a tool designed for community building and turned it into a weapon of personal power. Seeing the original charter reinforced Albert's conviction. The new board, with his encouragement, voted to formally adopt a new mission statement, borrowing heavily from that original, optimistic language. They placed it at the very beginning of the new bylaws, a permanent reminder of what their association was truly supposed to be about. It was a symbolic act, but a powerful one, officially burying Carol's dark legacy and reclaiming the hopeful spirit on which the neighborhood was founded. The change in Oak Creek was palpable, even to outsiders. Property values, which had stagnated under Carroll's oppressive regime due to the neighborhood's growing reputation for toxic disputes, began to rise. Realtors started marketing homes in the area by highlighting the active and friendly, community-led HOA. A complete reversal from a year prior. The new family that moved into Carroll's old house became active members of the community. Their children's laughter, a constant happy sound on the street. Albert watched all of this with a deep sense of contentment. He had not set out to be a revolutionary. He was a man who valued peace and order above all else. But he had learned that sometimes, true peace can only be achieved by fighting a necessary war. His battle with Carroll had cost him time, money, and a great deal of stress. It had scarred his property and disturbed his retirement. But what it had forged in its place was something far more valuable: a resilient, thriving community built on mutual respect and collective action. He had lost a pool for a few months, but he had helped his neighborhood find its soul. And as he floated in the cool, clear water of his restored pool on a sunny afternoon, with the distant sound of kids playing and neighbors chatting over fences, he knew, without a doubt, that it had been a fair trade. The court-ordered restitution payments began to arrive in monthly installments: a check from the State Department of Corrections, money garnished from Carroll's prison commissary account, and larger payments from the civil suit settlements. The HOA's portion went directly into the community's general fund, earmarked for the improvement projects. Albert's portion went to pay back his insurance company's deductible and cover the remaining repair costs. But after a few months, those debts were settled, and the money kept coming. It didn't feel right to Albert to profit from the situation. He saw the money as tainted, a byproduct of a miserable conflict. So, he decided to do something with it. He worked with Sarah and the HOA board to establish the Oak Creek Community Scholarship Fund. The fund would provide a yearly grant to a graduating high school student from the neighborhood who demonstrated a commitment to community service. The ongoing restitution payments would form the principle of the fund, ensuring it could exist in perpetuity. The first scholarship was awarded the following spring to a young woman who had organized a neighborhood cleanup initiative. At a small ceremony in the park, Albert presented her with the check. He didn't mention where the money had originally come from. He simply spoke about the importance of investing in one's community and building a better future. He had transformed the last vestiges of Carroll's greed into a force for good, turning her legacy of theft into a legacy of opportunity for the next generation. It was his final, quiet act of victory, a checkmate in a game she didn't even know was still being played. The psychological scars of Carroll's reign took longer to heal than the financial ones. For months after her arrest, some residents still exhibited a kind of institutionalized fear. They would nervously ask for permission before planting a new shrub or flinch when an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. The new board understood this. They made a conscious effort to be the opposite of Carroll's regime. Instead of sending out violation notices, they would go and talk to people. If someone's lawn was overgrown, a board member would stop by and ask if they were okay, if they needed help. More often than not, there was a reason: an illness, a family emergency. The board would then organize volunteers to help with mowing or yard work. This simple shift from a punitive to a supportive model fundamentally changed the neighborhood's culture. It was no longer about catching people doing something wrong. It was about helping people do things right. Albert watched this transformation with pride. It was a more profound victory than the legal battles. They hadn't just removed a tyrant. They had dismantled the entire system of fear she had created and replaced it with one of compassion. The trust that had been eroded was being rebuilt, one neighborly act at a time. The community wasn't just healing. It was becoming healthier and more resilient than it had ever been before. As Albert spent more time advising the new board, he began to think about his own future in a new light. The fight with Carroll had reawakened a part of him that had lain dormant since he'd stepped back from the bank's daily operations. The problem solver, the strategist, the builder. He realized he wasn't cut out for a life of pure leisure. He needed a project, a challenge. He decided to fully retire from the bank's board of directors, handing over the reins completely. Then, He took the significant capital he had earned over a lifetime in finance and started a small, non-profit consultancy. Its mission was to help homeowners in disputes with mismanaged or abusive HOAs. He partnered with a group of retired lawyers, accountants, and paralegals, including his friend Marcus, who donated some of his time. They offered their services on a sliding scale, providing free consultations to those who couldn't afford it. They helped people understand their rights, analyze financial documents, and organize their communities. Using the Oak Creek playbook as their model, it became his new passion. He had found a way to use his formidable skills, not to generate wealth, but to empower ordinary people. He had taken the worst experience of his retirement and turned it into his life's most meaningful work. He was no longer just Albert, the retired banker. He was Albert, the defender of homeowners, a title he wore with far greater pride. The story of the concrete in the pool became something of a local legend. When new families moved into Oak Creek estates, they would inevitably hear the tale from their neighbors, usually told with a mixture of horror and dark humor. It served as a powerful oral history, a reminder of how bad things had gotten and why the new community-focused approach was so important. The new HOA board, in a moment of inspired irony, even made it a part of their official new member welcome packet. Tucked in with the bylaws and the community event calendar was a small, laminated card. On one side, it had the contact information for all the board members. On the other, it just said, "Welcome to Oak Creek. We're glad you're here. We solve our problems by talking, not with concrete." It was a slightly cheeky but effective way of communicating their values. It signaled that this was a place with a past, but that the past had been learned from. It set a tone of open communication and mutual respect from day one. It ensured that the lessons of the Carol Peterson era would never be forgotten, and that the foundations of their new, healthier community were set, not in quick-drying cement, but in shared understanding and a commitment to being good neighbors. About a year after Carol was sentenced, Albert was tending to Eleanor's roses when he saw a moving truck pull up to a house down the street. It was a family he didn't know, who had bought their house a few months after the big shakeup. The father, a man in his late 30s, was struggling to get a large, awkward piece of furniture through the doorway. Without a second thought, Albert set down his trowel and walked over. "Need a hand with that?" he asked. The man looked up, sweating and grateful. "Yeah, that would be great. Thanks. I'm Mark." "Albert," he replied. Together, they maneuvered the heavy dresser into the house. Mark's wife offered Albert a bottle of cold water, and they stood on the lawn, chatting for a few minutes. They talked about their kids, their jobs, and how much they loved the neighborhood. "You know," Mark said, "one of the reasons we chose this area was because of the HOA." Albert raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yeah," Mark continued. "Our realtor told us it had a reputation for being one of the most proactive and friendly in the city. She said they have barbecues and a scholarship fund, and really look out for the residents. It sounded like a real community. You know?" Albert looked around at the peaceful street, at the well-tended lawns and the kids riding their bikes. He thought about the journey of the last 2 years. The letters, the threats, the court battles, the concrete. He looked at this young family, so happy to be a part of the very community he had fought so hard to save. A deep, profound sense of peace settled over him. "Yeah," Albert said, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I know. It really is." The infamous white van from Elegant Environments, Inc. sat in a police impound lot for months, a key piece of evidence. After the trial concluded, it was released. With the business bankrupt, the van was sold at a public auction. In a twist of fate, it was purchased by a new local business, a pool cleaning and repair service started by a young entrepreneur in town. One morning, Albert saw the van pull up to a neighbor's house. It was still the same van, but it had been repainted a cheerful sky blue. On the side, a new professionally painted logo read "Crystal Clear Pools. We fix what they break." The new owner, a friendly young man named Dave, recognized Albert from the newspaper stories. "You're the guy," he said, shaking Albert's hand enthusiastically. "Your story is half my business model. You wouldn't believe how many people call me with HOA-related pool problems." Albert had to laugh. The very vehicle that had been used as an instrument of his pool's destruction was now being used to maintain and beautify the pools of his neighbors. It was another small, perfect circle of karmic justice. The van, once a symbol of malicious intent and destruction, had been redeemed and repurposed. Just like the community itself, it was a rolling testament to the idea that even after the worst kind of damage, things could be cleaned up, repaired, and made better than they were before. The fall of Carol Peterson had one final, unexpected ripple effect. Her two bored cronies, the ones who had resigned in a panic after her arrest, had hoped to simply fade into the background. However, the civil suit and the forensic audit named them as negligent in their fiduciary duties. They had approved Carol's fraudulent expenditures without question, enabling her theft for years. While they avoided criminal charges, they were found civilly liable for their negligence. The court ordered them to pay a hefty settlement to the HOA. The financial penalty and public shame was too much for them to bear. Within 6 months of the verdict, both families had quietly put their houses up for sale and moved out of the neighborhood. Their departure marked the final purge of the old regime. It sent a clear message to everyone in Oak Creek and beyond. Being a passive enabler to a bully carries its own price. Willful ignorance is not a defense. This final exodus solidified the community's new direction. There was no one left who represented the old way of doing things. The new board, and the community as a whole, was able to move forward with a clean slate, fully united, and free from the last vestiges of the toxic power structure that had plagued them for so long. Life for Albert settled into a comfortable and fulfilling routine. He divided his time between his non-profit work, advising homeowners across the country, and his simple pleasures at home. He spent his mornings in his workshop, his afternoons by the pool, and his evenings enjoying the quiet camaraderie of his renewed neighborhood. He became a grandfather for the second time and took immense joy in teaching his grandson to swim in the same pool where he had taught his own children. The water held no dark memories for him now. It had been reclaimed, purified by the positive events that followed its desecration. He often thought of his father's old advice: "Don't let a bully take an inch." He had held his ground over a simple mailbox, and in doing so, he had unknowingly kicked off a chain of events that liberated an entire community and set a new course for the rest of his life. He had learned that true strength wasn't about the absence of conflict, but about how you faced it. He had faced his with logic, patience, and an unshakable belief in what was right. He had proven that one person, armed with the truth and the courage to speak it, could indeed stand against a tyrant and, with the help of their community, bring the whole corrupt kingdom tumbling down. The changes in Oak Creek Estates were not just procedural, they were physical. The neighborhood-wide vote on how to spend the recovered funds resulted in visible, tangible improvements. The new playground equipment was the first to be installed. A team of volunteers, Albert included, spent a weekend assembling the colorful new slides and swings. The sound of children's laughter that filled the park afterward was the best return on investment he could imagine. The tennis courts were resurfaced in a deep blue and green, and a local artist painted a mural on the practice wall, a vibrant landscape of oak trees. A new community garden was established in a previously unused common area, with plots assigned to families who wanted to grow their own vegetables and flowers. Mr. Henderson, with his expert knowledge, became the garden's unofficial mentor. The neighborhood was, quite literally, more beautiful, more vibrant, and more alive than it had been in years. The money Carol had intended for her own selfish enrichment had become the seeds of a community renaissance. Every new bench, every freshly painted line on the court, every new tree planted at the entrance was a testament to their collective victory, a beautiful and lasting monument to the fall of the Queen and the rise of her people. Years later, Albert was an old man, sitting on his patio, watching a new generation of neighborhood kids cannonball into his pool during the annual end-of-summer barbecue he now hosted. His non-profit had grown, helping thousands of homeowners. The Oak Creek Scholarship had sent over a dozen kids to college. The community was stable, peaceful, and known for its friendly, cooperative spirit. The story of the Concrete Karen, as she was now colloquially known, had faded into the realm of neighborhood folklore. A wild tale told to newcomers. Albert looked at the joy and harmony around him, a world away from the conflict that had defined that one tumultuous year. He realized the ultimate irony. In her quest to destroy his peace, Carol Peterson had inadvertently been the catalyst for him to find a deeper purpose, for his neighbors to find their collective voice, and for his community to find its true heart. She had meant to pour concrete on his happiness, but instead, she had only succeeded in laying the foundation for something far stronger and more beautiful to be built in its place. And that, he thought with a final contented smile, was the most righteous justice of all.